Team, I could have gone for a little longer of being still and knowing He is God. Once again, I am not who any of us expected to see up here today. This was supposed to be Mark's sermon, and he wanted to do it, but I took it from him, because what kind of friends would we be if we let him work in his son's hospital room? This is my first ever last-minute rush sermon, and last-minute anything is not my forte. And I say that only so that you'll be primed to dispense a lot of grace and maybe lower your expectations. But we're in the middle of a story right now, and we're dying to know what comes next. This story is about Naomi. It's called the Book of Ruth. But it's about Naomi, who left her home in Israel with her husband and sons and went to Moab, a neighboring country, but usually an enemy country. And while they were there, her husband and sons all died. And she returned to Israel with one of the sons' widows, Ruth, who, as a foreign widow, nobody expects to be very helpful in the type of society that they lived in. Even with Ruth coming back with her, Naomi says that when she left Israel, she went out full, but she has come back empty. But then the whole next chapter 2 is about Ruth turning out to be quite helpful, as she's gone into the fields to gather grain that the farmers leave out for the poor. This is a system that God had in place to care for the poor. And she's met one of these farmers, Boaz, who has been extra kind to her and has allowed her to gather with the women who work for him as a place of protection from the sort of harms that can come to a woman alone. So Naomi and Ruth are excited about this man and that God has provided food and protection through him. We're at this piece of the story today that's just a middle piece. It continues the story, but there's no big climax or twist in this section. In fact, the section ends with, well, let's just wait now. That doesn't mean there's not some really interesting things going on here or things that we can learn from, but it does mean we'll read the whole thing all at once, right at the beginning, because there's no secret, exciting thing I want to wait to spring on you later in the sermon. So if you have a paper Bible, open it to Ruth 3. If it's on your phone, just go ahead and put it away, because I'll have it up here for you, which is going to be better than the phone. All right. Ruth chapter 3. And remember, this story took place in, 1100 BC. It's a very different culture and different time. And so there's different culture, different language going on here, and we'll dig into some of that after we read it all through. Here we go, starting with verse 1. Then her mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may go well for you? Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash yourself and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, but don't reveal yourself to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall take notice of the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. And then he will tell you what you should do." And Ruth said to her, "All that you say, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled, and he bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And so he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are a kinsman redeemer." And then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first, by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. So now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you say, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. But now, although it's true that I am a kinsman redeemer, there is also another more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as surely as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning and got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, do not let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, give me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it out, and he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went into the city. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. Okay. So basically, Naomi's trying to find security for Ruth, so she hatches a plan. Ruth, dutiful daughter-in-law that she is, just says, sure thing, and takes off. But deviating a little from the plan, she proposes to Boaz and asks him to provide this security for her. That's what she's doing when she says, will you spread your cloak over your servant? For you are a kinsman redeemer. The spreading the cloak for them was a symbol of marriage. And a kinsman redeemer is a person who saves their family member out of a dire situation and restores them to a place of security. Boaz understands the spreading the cloak symbol and accepts. Now let's talk about a few things in more detail. Verse 1 shows us that Naomi's goal is that she is seeking security for her daughter-in-law. And she knows how this ancient culture works, that the only way for a woman to have security and a place in the community was to be connected to a man who has a place in the community and has the means to provide financial and physical protection. So she's forming a plan to secure security for Ruth with Boaz, who is a relative, which to us makes him sound less marriageable. But in their culture and situation, being part of the clan makes him more appropriate for marriage. She's done some research and knows that Boaz will be winnowing at the threshing floor that night. Now, for those of us who aren't grain farmers, the grains needed to be separated from the light papery stuff that grows on and around it. And the least tedious way at this time was to toss the grain up in the air and let the wind blow the light papery stuff away. And apparently in this area, a predictable evening wind would come in from the east, so they would do it in the evening. And for the threshing floor area, they would have chosen a spot that would catch this wind really well. So that's where he is and what he'll be doing. These preparations, wash yourself, anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes. This is getting presentable, right? This is getting clean and good smelling and clothed. This word that gets translated best clothes is really just an outer robe thing that both men and women would wear. So while some scholars see this as getting herself fancied up, others say it's probably describing putting away the clothing of a widow and putting on regular clothes as if she's moving forward with life. If you've ever watched Downton Abbey or some other show about long ago England, a man dies and his wife wears mourning clothes, like all black and maybe a veil for a certain amount of time. It's something like that. But either way, whether she's getting dressed up or declaring her time of mourning over, it has the same meaning and purpose, right? To show that she is available for marriage. Okay. This whole threshing floor plan seems weird on the surface. But when you dig down under the surface, it's even weirder. So, the author uses a lot of language here that can have double meanings in Hebrew. Remember, ours is a translation from Hebrew. If you read it with all of these set of meanings, it could look like something really inappropriate is happening here or being offered here. But if you read it with all of these meanings, it's not appropriate, though maybe still a little odd. Naomi tells Ruth in verse 4 to sneak into him where he's sleeping, uncover his feet, and lie down. And this is painful to read because feet is an ancient Hebrew euphemism for a body part that people like to have euphemisms for. There are places in the Old Testament that talk about covering the feet, and it's definitely not actual feet they're talking about. And uncovering a person's nakedness is a common way to refer to sexual relations. And also the verb that's translated here, lie down, is often used to refer to sexual intercourse. Bible scholars all know this, but most don't want to believe that Naomi was encouraging Ruth to such an act of brazen immorality. So they like to remind us that it could also mean just lying down at his literal feet. Uncovering them could be a symbol of something, or it could be that his feet getting cold would wake him up and he'd notice her. Could be, I guess. But I don't know why the author would have written it with these words if they didn't want you to feel a little scandalized when you read it. And I think it's possible that the original readers might have actually believed that Naomi would make this kind of suggestion. Naomi's faith tradition contains the story of Tamar, who did worse than this. We would all think it was worse than this, for sure. And they maybe wouldn't say she was all right in what she did, but the scriptures definitely say she was more right, more righteous in her actions than other characters in the story. Tamar is praised for what we would definitely consider immoral actions. And Naomi has grown up in this culture that offers Tamar as sort of a female heroine. So, we're a little worried about what Naomi is sending Ruth off to do. And then we get to see what Ruth actually does. She waits until he has eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful. Now, his heart was cheerful can definitely mean that he was drunk. But it doesn't have to. Both uses are accounted for in the Bible. But if we read it as she's waited until he's drunk, then it does seem like she's trying to set up something scandalous. So we're still a little shocked as we read. And then she comes and uncovers his feet and lays down. But then as we keep reading, it sounds like maybe she really did just do these things literally and not euphemistically, because he doesn't even notice her until the middle of the night. And then they say some words to each other that are just kind of sweet. So now, as readers, we're confused and are all of a sudden thinking, wait, this doesn't sound like what I thought was going to happen. And I think the author is intentionally setting us up to think that it's going to be an inappropriate sexual encounter so that we have this moment. So that we think at first, oh, I know how this story always goes. And then we're surprised because these two are different. Instead of the woman using her sexuality to manipulate the man into giving her what she wants, and the man taking advantage of an unprotected woman, she just asks him to marry her and help her. And he prays a blessing from God over her, and with all respect, says yes. Remember that at the beginning of the book, the author told us that this is taking place in the time of the Judges, which was an era in Israel's history of chronic covenant unfaithfulness by the Israelites. Lots of injustice, lots of violence. And in the book of Judges, especially as the book goes on and the nation spirals toward complete moral collapse, women tend to be the victims of that violence and injustice. There are so many stories of men with authority and power horribly abusing powerless women. And besides Deborah, who is a good example early on in the period, before it had really gotten so bad, there are a couple of women in that book who exert some power of their own over men, like Jael and Delilah. But they do it through deception and sexual manipulation, which honestly had to have seemed like all they had to work with. But not Ruth, and not Boaz. We're to expect another story from Judges, and then be surprised by the contrast. First, Ruth. Ruth is a powerless woman with very low status in this world. But she believes in Yahweh and in his people and in the power of a good kinsman redeemer and in the systems that God has in place for caring for his people, like that of the kinsman redeemer. Let's talk about some of the words that are used of Ruth here and in the book as a whole. Boaz praises her here in verse 10 and 11. He says, "You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first, by not going after young men, whether poor or rich." Now, if her first kindness was leaving her homeland to remain with Naomi, we're talking about kindnesses toward Naomi, it seems. And her coming to Boaz instead of to the younger men, which one would assume would have been preferred by a young woman, it's a kindness to Naomi, not just to Boaz, because marrying one of Naomi's relatives secures Naomi a place of security in the community as well. Ruth's firstborn, the way this system is set up, Ruth's firstborn will legally carry on the name and family line of Naomi's late husband and son. But what I really want to point out in this statement is this kindness word, which is the word in Hebrew, chesed, that was mentioned in chapter 1 and that Mark explained more fully last week in chapter 2. It's this word, it's a rich word full of depth and meaning that we can never capture in a simple translation. It's this loyal, forever covenant love. And it's active, not a feeling that just exists inside a person. In Hebrew, you do hesed. In chapter 1, Naomi had prayed that God would do chesed for Ruth, and he is, throughout the book, acting in this kind of love for her. But also, now, Ruth has stepped into this doer of chesed role herself, like God. Boaz goes on to say about her in verse 11 that everyone knows she is a woman of excellence. Now, Ruth, the lowly Moabitess, is elevated with this phrase. In verse 11 here, she is described, listen carefully, as an Eshet Hayil. In 2:1, Boaz was described as a Gibor Hayil. Do you hear the matching word there? Hayil. The differing words that you hear mean woman and man, or like mighty man. But he is a man of Hayil. She is a woman of Hayil. So what does this word mean? In my NASB translation that I use, Boaz's phrase is translated, a man of great wealth. But Ruth is absolutely poverty-stricken. So it's noticeable that she gets called this as well. And it also suggests great wealth is not the only possible meaning of the word. Do you know where else this word, in fact, this phrase, Eshet Hayil, is used? The impossible woman of Proverbs 31. That chapter is a description of this remarkable woman that early in life is an inspiration to all us women, and then later causes us all to despair. She does have money, but that's not the point of the chapter. The overall picture is of a woman of great substance. She is everything in one package. And I am pretty sure she is a theoretical woman. But Ruth is held up here as this kind of woman because of her simple but determined trust in doing things God's way. Do you know that the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, orders the books differently than we do in our Old Testament? They're all the same books, but they're in a different order. And we've got Ruth right after Judges because it fits there nicely chronologically and helps to highlight the contrast between these faithful people with the unfaithful people of Judges. But in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth comes after Proverbs, which ends with chapter 31. So you've just read about this theoretical woman of Chayil, and then you turn the page and you see the real life example. Standing out from the women of her day, she is a woman of power, but also of honesty, integrity, and chesed-type kindness and love. In fact, the power and agency that Ruth has, that the other women of her day don't have, comes from her confidence in living in this way, and her trust in her God, Yahweh, whose way this is to live. Can I say that this woman culture does not seem that foreign to me? And here's the application that Mark couldn't have gotten away with, but I can. We live in a time where people today, like the author of Judges was doing, are calling people out about violence and injustice toward women. And that is the right thing to do. The author of Judges knew that you have to tell the stories and horrify people, or they won't see. And women are claiming their power, which is totally fair. But if you're claiming power out of a place of historical powerlessness, it's easy to rationalize ruthless, manipulative, and selfish means, and to not care about the welfare of those who are the historically powerful. The words about what I deserve and prioritizing what's good for me are tempting. But Ruth shows us and reminds us of a right use of power and agency, with honesty, integrity, and chesed toward others, even the historically powerful, like Boaz. And she knows that living in God's way is not about rolling over and choosing powerlessness, but about understanding and believing that there is a richer, deeper, purer power that involves acting with strength and courage, but also with love and gentleness and selflessness and humility. And in that life, you don't just become a powerful woman. Let's not settle for that. You become a woman of great substance. Okay, we're surprised by Ruth and how she stands in contrast to the women of her day, but also Boaz. Neither of them behave how we would expect. Boaz is a man of authority and status who could have taken advantage of this woman who has no man to protect or defend her legally. And in this day when people are disregarding God's commands about how to treat people, he probably could have done it without consequence. But in great contrast to the men of his day, he understands his role as redeemer, and that he is to be the distributor of God's chesed to those God brings into his life. We're going to leave the discussion of the word redeemer and Boaz's role as redeemer to Mark for next week, because next week's passage is heavy with the act of redemption and the role of the redeemer, so it belongs there. And I didn't want to steal his thunder. Honestly, I didn't have time to steal his thunder. Redemption needs to be done really well. We're going to focus on Boaz as the distributor of God's chesed. But let's see, we got to finish off this passage first. This explanation of this closer relative that he talks about in verses 12 and 13 also kind of fits best into next week's sermon. But this statement here does tell us a couple of things. It maybe explains why Boaz has not initiated this marriage himself. There was someone else who had a right to make the offer to Ruth first. But also, significantly, it tells us that Boaz was not obligated to marry Ruth. If anyone was, it was this other guy. Boaz accepts her proposal out of some kind of love for her, and some desire to do right by her and to offer her the protection and security that she needs. Then, by allowing her to stay for the night, he protects her from a potentially dangerous return home in the middle of the night. And then, by sending her off early, so as not to be seen, he protects her reputation. And it seems that maybe if people thought something inappropriate had happened between them, that could have jeopardized the marriage. So he has stepped into the role of her protector. And then by filling her shawl, like a bag, with grain to take with her back to Naomi, he also shows he intends to be her, in fact, their provider. When Ruth gets back to Naomi, she reports the words Boaz said about the grain. "Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty." All right, I'm going to build a case here, so hang with me. Remember in chapter 1, Ruth and Naomi had just arrived back in Bethlehem from Moab, where Naomi had lost everything. And she said, "I went away full, and I came back empty." And she blamed God for her emptiness, but also saw him as the source of blessing, the only way that emptiness could be remedied. But now here, Boaz tends to the problem of Naomi's emptiness. It's a partial remedy by sending provision and saying, "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty." Because that's the problem God is resolving in this book. Providence, that idea of God working behind the scenes to make things happen in the world, is a key theme that is woven throughout this book. And how God does that in this story teaches us something. Naomi goes to God's land in time of trouble because she knows that God is the only one who can remedy her emptiness. But now here, the word empty is supposed to remind us of Naomi's problem, and we see that it is Boaz who is filling her emptiness. Okay, second point in the case. In the last chapter, chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz noted that Ruth had come to seek refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. And now I'm going to give you another Hebrew word. She came to seek refuge under the kanaf of the God of Israel. It's like the outer edges of something that's spread out. They use it about a building and clothing, and then for a bird, it's his wings. And that's probably the metaphor Boaz is going for here. But now, in chapter 3, verse 9, and we don't see it in our English translation, but Ruth asks Boaz to spread his kanaf over her as a symbol of providing protection and security of marriage. She's come for God's refuge, and she receives it through Boaz. Last one. Back in 2:20, Naomi said, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not stopped his chesed to the living and to the dead." I guess my translation has not stopped showing his chesed to the living and the dead. Wasn't there. But okay. The question is, who is the who? Is it he, Boaz, or is it the Lord that was just referenced? In English, they often translate it so that it seems clear that the one who has not stopped his chesed is Yahweh. But in Hebrew, it's ambiguous. Is it Yahweh or is it Boaz? And in light of these other times where the author sort of blurs the distinction or overlays God's act and Boaz's act, it seems possible the ambiguity is intentional. The messenger is seen as one and the same as the sender. That when someone acts on God's behalf, that is God acting as well. We're seeing in this story a picture of God restoring blessing and goodness to a suffering person's life through the generosity, kindness, and faithfulness of the community of God's people. First, the faithfulness of this foreigner Ruth, who chose to be God's people in chapter 1. And then Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, who extends God's chesed to them. It's a story about how the primary vehicle of God's restoration is the faithfulness and loyalty and love of his people. When Naomi and Ruth were desperate and impoverished in Moab, they went back to Yahweh's land, back to Yahweh's people. And that was where the blessing was to be found. Now, there are two sides to this coin. When I find myself in a desperate situation, suffering and empty and in need of filling, how should I expect God to address it? Where should I go to receive his help? One answer, the Book of Ruth tells us, is to his people. We know that through his people is not the only way God can work, but it does seem to be his favorite way to work. It is how he usually chooses to make things happen. God is the source of all blessing and goodness in the world, but he distributes it through his people. Seek refuge there. The other side of the coin is that as a member of the people of God, I am to be a distributor of his blessing and goodness in the world. I do that through acts of chesed to whoever God brings into my life. Those who are seeking refuge need to be able to find it under my wing and under our collective wings. Boaz challenges us to stand out from the people of our day and rebel against the advice of the world to protect myself and my way of life and to seek my own comfort and prosperity. He challenges us to stand out from that common way of life and do chesed. Be the place of refuge that God wants to provide for the vulnerable, the powerless, and the suffering that he loves. Living this way is living in God's way, in his land of blessing. And we don't have less of the blessing by sharing it. The blessing increases as we share it. This is a richer, deeper, and purer prosperity than what the world seeks. And by doing chesed and distributing God's blessing, you don't just become a prosperous person. Let's not settle for that. You become a person of great substance. Let's pray. Thank you, God, for showing us the way to a life of blessing and sharing your blessing, a life of love and sharing your love, for providing a place of refuge in the community of your people, and entrusting us to provide that refuge to your people. Thank you for showing us a better way to become, better than what our world can offer, more than being just powerful people or prosperous people. You show us the way. You are the way for us to become people of great substance. Amen.